Welcome to our session on collaborating on a discipline-specific writing guide, critical thinking and writing in psychology. I'm Cheryl Hofstetter-Duffy. I'm the Director of Writing across the curriculum at Fort Hays State University and a longtime English professor. Also presenting today will be Jeanette Naylor-Tinknell, psychology professor, and Carol Patrick, also a psychology professor. Those two are really the ones who spearheaded this project. And also Mary Alice Wade, who is the interim dean of Forsyth Library here at Fort Hays. Our presentation schedule will start with the why and the how of the book, and then we'll move on to the library contributions that Mary Alice will talk about, the quality of writing chapters that I wrote, and then we'll finish up with how the book has been used now that it's out and in print. Take it away.
We really noticed a sharp decline in students' ability to do research, and that includes finding quality sources, evaluating those sources, basically reading the different sections, and then implementing those in a scientific manner. So processing APA style and thinking scientifically and designing scientific arguments. They also lacked information literacy, understanding that not all sources are the same, should hold equal weight. Some sources have inherent bias depending on the author and their affiliation, things like that. They also lacked just general critical thinking skills. They have a lot of logical fallacies. They're trying to make conclusions where A does not equal B, that A equal, they're just jumping in their conclusions and not making sound arguments. So many years ago, a course at Fort Hays in our department, we taught APA style, we taught some basic things about how to do these things, but it still felt short of the goals that we really wanted. So we decided to revamp that course to really address professional writing in multiple contexts. A lot of our students, and probably a lot of your students as well, think, well, I'm never going to write. That's just not, I'm going to be a psychologist. I'm going to be a clinical psychologist. I'm not going to write. I'm not going to do research. And they don't seem to understand the amount of writing that psychologists do in a variety of contexts. So we try to combat this, this fallacy. We also have a lot of students who think, well, I'm not going to do public speaking. I'm just going to sit with my clients and I'm just going to interact with them. And they don't see that as delivering a message or delivering content. And they need to have good speaking skills in order to be able to deliver sometimes difficult content when dealing with clients or when dealing with the public. We also wanted to better prepare our students for the careers, because we know that one of the things that employers want is someone who can read and write in a coherent fashion, even if that's a simple email and doesn't accidentally hit reply all with lots of grammatical errors and typos in them. We also wanted to encourage just general lifelong information literacy. We know that the education that professionals get at the college level is not the end of their education. And if they're going to be psychologists and in many other fields, they need to make sure that they are staying up on current literature, especially with access to the digital information that's out there now. So we designed a sophomore level course. This is a course that's designed to add to those basic comp classes that students are required to take. And the idea here is that we would like to teach formal writing. This is moving beyond some of the basic sentence structure, things like that. Not that those are not key, our English component person here, but helping them, once they have those foundation skills, move on to logic and flow and some of the things like that we could address. We also want to make sure that they understand where to get information, how to read research, and how to incorporate that into their thinking, how to discuss, how to take turns, how to go back and forth, which is especially helpful in certain fields in psychology. So we want to integrate some information about how to find sources, how to identify primary versus secondary, integrate technology into their organization of materials, into their thinking, so that they can be better prepared for those types of things. And then we have them write an integrative pro-con paper on scientifically based arguments. They have to have a pro with using research to empirically back, and they have to have a con, using scientifically based information to empirically back their arguments. We also encourage them to do peer review and encourage their editing skills, so that they can look back on their writing and really come at it from a really objective perspective. Then at the end, they have to present their findings to demonstrate their critical thinking skills. And they do a presentation debate type of thing where they pose questions to the other side and must defend their arguments. So that was the basic idea of the course. But the problem that we ran into is that there is no comprehensive textbook that does all of these types of things. And what we ended up with was kind of a hodgepodge of textbooks. So there was a textbook that talked about the value of writing. There was a textbook that talked about APA style. There was a textbook that we could get that talked about what is good writing. And then they had a textbook where they had these pro-con arguments that they could work from. So the students were spending lots of money for 4 textbooks that didn't even quite cover all of the areas that we wanted. So we were supplementing with a lot of different things, and we decided that, you know what, let's just make our own. We knew what we needed to teach. We knew people who had areas of expertise. Let's just do that. So we came up with this idea of reaching out to people in the field, experts in their area, to address when and why we write as psychologists. We all do it in different ways, but we do it on a daily basis. Different types of writing. So there's formal writing, there's informal writing, there's writing a scientific paper, there are writing clinical notes, there are writing IEP reports. There are lots of different types of writing. But all of them are essentially persuasive arguments. You're trying to sell something. You're trying to sell your client or persuade your client this is the best course of action. You're trying to set up a plan to help best service a particular program. There's good writing as well, right? We know that it has to be concise, it has to be clean, it has to be grammatically correct in order for your writing to be taken seriously. You have to be able to find and evaluate different sources, know what are good sources, where to find them, how to read them. And then you need to look at a controversial topic and be able to argue a coherent side. So that was the goal. When we found collaborators, essentially what we did is just reached out to the people we knew. I know that sounds fairly easy, but we all went to grad school. We all have colleagues. We all have students, former students, friends across the country, across the world who have areas of expertise. I am not a writing specialist. I am not a librarian. Some of the things that I know, the grammar rules are just things I didn't even know had names to it. So they were just things that I did. So we reached out to people across the university and across the fields. So we have English professors, we have librarians, we have media specialists that talk about technology. We reached out to psychologists, both in academia, in practitioners. We also reached out to former students, grad students, undergrads, with areas of expertise to help with some of those controversial topics as well. So this is really a multidisciplinary approach to teach those skills on how to think and how to write like a psychologist. We can help them with the APA style and we can help them with the psychology thinking, but we can't always help them best with the grammar and we can't help them best with finding resources and things like that. So we reached out to those professionals to give us the help, to show us the value of writing in our field.
Okay, so finding, reading, and organizing scientific work was the section that the librarian faculty wrote. And we had 3 basic points that we wanted to cover. Basically, information literacy as a concept, information literacy skills employed within a psychology context, and as she mentioned earlier, technology, integrating technology to help organize their research. So what is information literacy? At its most simple, it's basically a set of abilities that allow you to assess your information need, know how to find it efficiently, know how to critically evaluate it, and then use it ethically to produce new knowledge. The first chapter was Information Literacy by Robin Hart, another librarian. And she covered the big topics within information literacy, and then accompanied each topic with an example using psychology articles so that it walked you through each step and how it would be used. She started with choosing a manageable topics. That's something students often have trouble with. And then how do you choose keywords and combine them with Boolean operators to construct an effective search strategy? Looking at all the different source types that there are, peer-reviewed, non-peer-reviewed, trade publications, blogs, all of those kind of things. How to distinguish between those and how to judge the authority that each has given the context in which you're writing. She had them formulate a research plan, which is basically what we've talked about. What am I researching? What's my topic statement? Where am I going to look? How am I going to form my search strategy? And to go along with that, a research log, which is a really helpful tool and practice to get into, where you say, okay, this is where I looked, this is how I searched, this is what I found, and then your reaction to that. For example, I found a lot of irrelevant sources with this search, so I need to tweak it so it's a little narrower, and then show how you did that. So they have a history of both how their search is developed, and also if they want to repeat something, how did I find this? This was good. They have it written down so they can repeat it easily. Evaluating information. Evaluating it first for, does it meet the standards of the assignment? So I've had a lot of students who maybe they have a great project that's really interesting, but at base it does not meet the criteria for the assignment, and they have to start over, which is nobody wants that. So evaluating it that way, but also evaluating the content for bias, for other kind of logical flaws, to determine if it's something that they want to use. Then using the information ethically. A lot of this has to do with citation. So citations in the context of scholarship as a conversation. So research is a conversation back and forth between different researchers. I learned this, well, here's what I found, it's a little different, and that when they create new knowledge, they're contributing to that conversation. And citation is a part of that. It recognizes the hard work that went into creating that information, also gives you a way to find those sources and evaluate things for yourself. And these are basically just the basic skills of anybody who is information literate. The next chapter was database searching for psychology topics, and this was my chapter. And I wanted this to be very practical and really applying the concepts that were in the previous chapter. So I talked a lot about how do you identify the best databases for psychology. Also talking, there's a lot of different kinds of databases, and especially open access, both because I wanted them to know what open access was, and also because at some point they're no longer going to have access to subscription library databases. I like to talk a little bit about, tell students, they have an idea usually that their professors are all getting rich on all the scholarly articles that they're publishing. So when they learn that not only do they not get paid, they often have to pay to have them published, And then the taxpayers or the universities who fund that research then have to turn around and pay for it to get it back. They can really see the unfairness of that. And so I like to tell them about that to show how the open access movement has developed. I tell them about interlibrary loan, just because most of them have never heard of that before. And then the rest of my chapter, I invented a hypothetical student with an assignment and went through step by step of all the things that the student needs to do to meet the criteria of the assignment. And I worked in the roadblocks that I see students hit over and over again and had her work through them so that they knew how to get past those common problems. We talked about how to identify relevant articles, the importance of presenting balanced evidence, a pro and con, as the assignment required, and the importance of including diverse voices. And to help them do that, I included a list of journals that focus on underrepresented groups, whether it's gender or age or race or whatever. Touched on citation mining as a way to find relevant articles, not only ones cited by an article, but looking forward to newer articles that have cited the article they're using. And finally, a list of troubleshooting steps to solve those common problems. The last chapter is Technology for Developing and Writing a Research Project by Andy Tinknell. And this was the integrating technology tools into their work process to make things easier for themselves. For example, an assignment calculator, which can help you break down your project into parts, and it'll give you due dates, so you know where you should be in there. Project management software like Trello, similar to identify tasks and track due dates, but just track your progress. Also useful for group projects if you have to assign different parts to different people. Using mind maps to help identify all the different pieces of your research project. Outlining software, citation management like Zotero, word processing programs like MS Word or Google Docs, which is great for collaboration. And lastly, presentation tools, because they did have to do a presentation at the end, like PowerPoint, Google Sheets, or Prezi.
Okay. I was in charge of the quality of writing chapters, 3 chapters in the textbook, and I really felt as an English professor and the director of WAC that I was in a good position to do this, but I did need to immerse myself in the discipline of psychology, and much like the dachshund on your screen, I dove into the discipline of psychology so that I could include examples and draw from psychological resources. So, for example, in Chapter 5 on the types of writing, I started with some general types of writing that you probably would recognize, like narration, division, classification, and process. But for each of those, I put the psychology slant on it. For example, for narration, I drew upon genres that a psychologist would use, like case notes, for example, documenting what happened during a session. Or maybe a persuasive paper on preventive discipline in the classroom might open with a narrative paragraph on a chaotic classroom scene that you would then revisit in the conclusion and narrate that scene with preventive discipline in place. For division and classification, I chose as a source a popular psychology periodical, Psychology Today, and chose an article for illustration, The Big 3 Keys to Relationship Success. So I took relationship success and divided it into the 3 elements, and that came from a psychology-based source. And for process, I drew upon a familiar theorist in psychology, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's The 5 Stages of Death and Dying. And I also talked about specific types of writing in psychology, like the book review, the abstract, the annotated bibliography, the literature review. And for each of those, I would emphasize the audience, the purpose, and the persona you would consider as a psychologist. So for example, if you're writing a book review, your audience is going to be other psychologists who might be interested in the book you're reviewing. So you might not have to explain certain terms because your audience would know those terms. Your purpose is to give potential readers of the book an overview of its content and structure, kind of a combination of summary and critique, what the book has in it and how useful or effective that might be. And then persona. A lot of times students write like students. And it's like, let me just get this down and get done with it. But no, adopt a persona of a psychologist who's trying to come across as a thoughtful, informed reader with an overall positive professional tone. And Chapter 6 on writing the persuasive research paper. Again, I've been teaching persuasive research paper for decades, but in writing this chapter for this textbook, I really drew upon, there are 10 chapters at the end of this book called issue chapters, covering topics like, should children be allowed to participate in contact sports? Is parental divorce harmful to children? Is gender a binary construct? Should technology be used in education? And so on. And I used those issues from that section of the textbook that are psychology-based issues for my illustrations and examples. For example, if I'm talking about narrowing a topic, then the example that I used was don't start so broad that you're going to write about sports, narrow it down a bit. You're getting there with effects of sports participation on high school athletes. And then a fully narrowed topic would be the negative effects of contact sports on the adolescent brain. When I talked about research questions, I gave as examples research questions that would apply to some of those chapters in the issue chapters section. Are electronic devices in the classroom conducive to learning? Is gender binary? Is divorce bad for children? Does tracking sex offenders make us safe? Again, all topics from those chapters. When I taught deductive reasoning, instead of using the syllogism that I typically use, which is all blondes are brilliant, Dr. Duffy is blonde, therefore, Dr. Duffy is brilliant. But instead of using that syllogism, I used a syllogism based on one of those chapters at the end of the book. So the major premise becomes all childhood trauma can lead to PTSD. Minor premise, spanking is a form of childhood trauma, therefore spanking can lead to PTSD. And talk about how the major premise is probably fairly accepted, but that minor premise that spanking is a form of childhood trauma, that's something that you might have to prove in your paper. Logical fallacies. Again, I have a handout that I've been using for years. Who am I kidding? Decades. But you know, and the definitions would stay the same. Like for the bandwagon appeal, this is that everyone else is doing it appeal. But the majority view is not necessarily the right or appropriate view, and further evidence is needed. So the example I would give would be, or was, many high schools in the U.S. issue electronic devices to their students, so those devices must be conducive to learning. You know, if so many high schools are doing it, it must be the right thing. Or is it? I don't know. Chapter 7 was just on good writing, and that's kind of what Jeanette was alluding to when she was talking about, you know, the grammar, the nitty-gritty bits, and style too. And again, this is an area that I feel pretty comfortable with. You know, I've got my tried and true advice and examples, but I needed to realize my audience were psychology students and future psychologists, so I use those examples. For example, when I'm teaching a clear and direct style, I used a psychology example for what is clear and direct, what might be too informal, what might be overdone, you're trying really too hard to sound smart. So my clear and direct example is a psychologist's first step is to determine what is causing a client's anxiety. Clear and direct. Too informal, first person, second person, some slang in there. I believe that job one for a psychologist is trying to get to the bottom of what's causing your anxiety. And because I had so much fun writing it, yeah, I'm going to read to you the wordy piece of Ingfish. And if you don't know what Ingfish is, Google Ingfish. So before embarking upon a procedure of psychological treatment, a psychologist will initially, at the primary stages of interaction with his or her client, seek, with as much accuracy as possible, a kind of ascertainment of the underlying cause or causes residing at the very root of a client's anxiety that has prompted said client to pursue professional diagnosis and resolution in the first place. Please don't write like that. Passive voice. Again, as an English professor, we spend a lot of time talking about ways to avoid passive voice. It can be stilted, it can be wordy, but there are times when passive voice is called for example, in the method section of a scholarly psychological paper, so that instead of writing, I grouped the participants by age, you should write it in passive voice. Participants were grouped by age. For handling quotations for that section, I found a sample quotation from the American Journal of Psychology to use as an example. So if I'm talking about you're mentioning the authors in the attribution, you're not mentioning the authors, you have a short quotation, you have a long quotation, you're paraphrasing. Each of those examples was from that article in the American Journal of Psychology. Apostrophes, I had to double check because I know the rule for MLA, which is what we use in English, but for APA style, is it the same rule? Now you know it is. It's the same rule. So for singular nouns, even ones that end in S, you add an apostrophe plus S. So it's going to be this client's profile, William James's pragmatism with apostrophe S, a day's pay, the hypothesis' flaw. Yeah. Comma rules, I'm a little bit famous, maybe infamous, I don't know, notorious for my comma rules handout. I have this green handout, it has 18 comma rules. Every example on that comma rule handout is a squirrel example. And for example, if I'm talking about compound sentences, that first example there, Dr. Duffy saw a squirrel, comma, and she fed it an acorn from her laptop bag. I may or may not carry acorns in my laptop bag. But for this book, I had to change my examples, and I felt that, Carol and Jeanette might not appreciate it if I used squirrel examples. So instead, for a compound sentence, I had an example like this. The results are invalid, comma, for the sample size was too small. And finally, when I suggested additional resources for the Writing Center, I think any discipline could use what I said about going to the Writing Center, but when I talked about going to the Purdue OWL, I especially focused on the APA guide portion of the Purdue online writing lab, and I also drew students' attention to the APA style blog. Okay?
Okay. Well, first of all, I think we would like to thank these two wonderful people and then somebody wonderful sitting behind the camera, Andy Tinknell, because they have contributed greatly not only to the book and the chapters, but they also speak to our students about these issues and help us with that, which since I learned most of what I know about English from doing a lot of reading, I kind of know what's right, but I don't always know why. So it's incredibly helpful. And I certainly don't have that handle on the technology and issues that our library folks do. So they've just been wonderful. Bring your library people sodas or treats, coffee, and get them involved with your classes because they do wonderful things. So then moving forward, after the book was published, we of course signed up for our class, and then you run into things like, oh, we have new chapters, so we have to come up with new assignments. And so thus, we have new assignments. And I just want to give two examples of units we've added and assignments we've added based on the changes related to the book. Okay, so before the book, when we talked about information literacy, information that came from all of our library folks when they wrote their chapters, really before the book, we talked about some simple concepts that are important to psychologists. The difference between getting resources from popular press and academic press, with the idea that you need to go straight to the source, academic press, because popular press So let's say you're talking about a psychology journal and then the Psychology Today report of it. What's written in Psychology Today is written essentially somebody interpreting what was written in the original psychological literature. And so the issue becomes, are they interpreting it correctly? So, we stress the importance of going back to the original academic writing. We talked about primary and secondary sources in psychology. And primary sources are essentially, I'm sure you know this, but particularly within psychology, primary sources are the actual research reports. So people have done research on some psychological related concept and written up their responses, or their results. And so that primary article is really what I like to call the just the facts stuff. This is where we get the direct report. Now, secondary types of stuff, which can be either secondary academic articles where other psychologists put together a variety of research results and try to bring meaning to them, that's a useful thing. But still, you've got a step of interpretation there. And so we also talk about the importance then of going back to the primary. And then you may find, in fact, that a secondary source is 3 or 4 steps back down the line where essentially the person, if they're using the secondary report, is looking at what Jeanette said, about what Mary Alice said, about what Cheryl originally wrote in her research, and we all know the gossip game doesn't work. So we talk about, the importance of primary research, and we also talk about, finally, the importance of research and psychological writings being evaluated by peers in psychology, because we all have our biases and we all maybe perhaps interpret things incorrectly, or there's another interpretation, so that's useful. So certainly peer reviewed is important. And so we talk about things like Psychology Today may be a great place to go to find what are the research articles out there on your topic, but you need to go read the research articles because that person may not know a lot about it. And in addition to not knowing, they may have actually tried to make it more entertaining or whatever, and that can begin to add to issues. So one of the new units, though, that we added, basically we added information literacy and logical fallacy units in class. Some others as well, but we're limited it to that too. So the first one on information literacy looked at the ties between media and scientific literacy. So essentially, there seems to be something out there in the world today, and many of our students absorb that there is no actual truth, that everything people say are opinions, and they're all equally valid. So are all opinions equal? No. So information literacy, at least in this class, is talking a lot about that. And so truth is relative, maybe to a certain extent, but there are ways to assess whether something is actually true or more likely to be true than other things. So just because people espouse different positions and they don't tell you about their biases doesn't mean you can't begin to parse out and try to figure out what is closest to the truth. So we start by, and in fact, this is just these next several slides are actual slides from the course where we talk about these issues. And we talk about ways to figure out what's likely to be more truthful. First, the idea that you need to check more than one source, particularly because there can be some bias in how information is shared from person to person to person, as I just discussed. Also, to consider when you're reading something, is it a direct, verifiable fact that the person is talking about, or someone's opinion? So separating opinion from fact is important. And then finally, what is it that helps you separate fact from an opinion, and to separate reasonably good opinion from opinion you perhaps should not be as targeted toward? Okay. So when we talk about something, we first start talking about media literacy and what you should look at. So when you're reading information online about a popular psychology topic. You need to ask yourself, is the person who's reporting this, do they have a bias of any kind that I should be concerned about? Also, the person reporting this, do they have the expertise to report it? So what are their training and credentials in the area they're talking about? What experiences are they using to interpret the fact? And I think it probably goes without saying that you want somebody who's as unbiased as possible and who has expertise in the area that they're talking about. And then also you may want to know, in addition to their training and credentials, what is their specific area knowledge? So that would be something like psychologists. Jeanette and I are developmental psychologists. So we don't write a lot about clinical psychology. And in fact, the only clinical psychology article I've ever written was one looking at experimental methods used to validate clinical theories and therapies, because I'm an experimental psychologist. And so you really have to look at the person's expertise. So one psychologist isn't the same as another psychologist, and consider that. And of course, what needs to be considered more than that, of course, is, something that's popular today, that one person's opinion about the usefulness, say, of a vaccine is different than another person's. And so when we talk about media, we talk about, well, who do you listen to and why? And how do you interpret what they're talking about? And so it is important to look at that. And we talk about that more here in a minute. But also, it's important to find out how recent and current the information is that the media person is providing. So the media person may very well be trying to make a point, particularly if they're biased. And so in that case, with that bias, you have to ask, does that person really understand what they're reading? Or that poll they're citing, how was that poll constructed? Was that poll something that had leading questions and it was only sent to certain people? So that brings us into the concept of media literacy. And you may have seen this before. It's one of the common ways of looking at different sources in the media and how they treat things. And the reason I like to bring this forward, not because it's perfect or that you can't argue different things about it, I make sure and cover that with the students. You may not agree where a particular media outlet is on this chart. You may argue, I've heard people talk about whether one end of this chart is as bad as the other end of this chart. That's really not what we're looking at here. What we're looking at is on essentially the downward axis. It goes from, are they giving original facts, all the way down to the bottom where they're really deliberately not just using opinion, but they're trying to persuade you of something. Okay, so that's one thing to think about when you're looking at the truthfulness of a source. Is it original facts? Is it original facts with some interpretation? Or is it sort of facts from a source that they haven't cited, from a poll that was 5 years old, from an unindicated source? And so that's very important. Now, the other axis talks about bias. Here it talks about left to right, or for you guys, left to right. Anyway, the thing that's important about the bias is maybe not which direction it is so much, but who is interpreting it. So here we talk a lot about the concept of expertise in an area, which I've mentioned in the past slide, and also the level of the bias or the amount of the bias. So if you have someone who's very biased with very little training in an area, maybe that's not the best source. So if you'd like to move forward. So what we do then is take that and relate it to scientific literacy. And what's interesting is on the media graph, we're really talking about, is it facts or is it opinion? And then is it biased one way or another? And then what's the expertise if the person is giving an opinion? So if it's just the facts, sometimes it matters less whether there's bias. But if it's not just the facts, what's the bias and what's the expertise? And you have to figure that out. Now, one way to kind of figure out, am I getting the right information, is to get it from as many sources as possible. But if you're going to get something from one source, you want to make sure you get it from the best possible source you can get it. So the person who's giving you just the facts without a lot of bias and has expertise in the area to give you those facts. Now, when you're diving into the psychological literature, and that's something they'll be getting to do right after they hear this lecture, you need to look for those things still. So in our course, we make them use primary sources only. So only the research reports for their core information. They can use secondary, written by people who didn't do the research information if it's published in a psychological journal, but not if it's in popular press or other kinds of things. And so essentially then we're asking them as they look at different articles on their topic, and they'll have one topic. They might have are contact sports good for children or not good for children? And there's points on either side. And basically what they can do is first ask, does this person who's writing this secondary article have a bias if they're using it, a secondary article? And how strong is that bias? So in psychology, bias isn't left or right wing so much as this is my theory and this is their theory and I want to support my theory. So you kind of have to get a sense of your author and whether they have a bias because they may use, in fact, we hear the term confirmation bias, they may actually try to only find articles when they're writing something up just to support the point they think is correct. And so you have to be careful about that kind of bias. It's very important. Another thing you want to look into is their expertise. This relates just like to the media. Who are we going to believe? So if I'm going to believe Dr. Fauci more about vaccines than I am the guy in high school who didn't pay attention during science class, probably a good idea. Who am I going to pay attention to when it's an article about the use of particular therapy in psychology? I'm going to pay attention to the person who has a great deal of training in that therapy. So I want to know their expertise. I want to know the specific area of knowledge they've studied before I trust them, particularly in a secondary article. I want to know how trustworthy are they. So we know people out there who have put together interesting sorts of videos related to the vaccine issue, who have had, who are doctors, but maybe aren't medical doctors or epidemiologists, right? So it can be very problematic if it's not the right area of expertise, or let's say they got kicked out of doctordom because they did some bad stuff. That also, is an issue and a problem, and they need to understand the trustworthiness of the person. They need to ask, is article peer-reviewed? Because bias is the concern here. And peer review helps eliminate bias. So if you've got the person who's trying to push only their theory and only information that supports their theory, a peer review will take care of that right away. And so colleagues will step in and say, no, you need to cover this stuff too. So peer review is very important. And by the way, when you search in the search engine, you can find that. You can click peer reviewed and only use those. And also you want to look again at whether the information is recent and current. Recent means published in the last 5 years or so. Current means the state of the art of knowledge, because some knowledge moves faster than other knowledge. And so the assignments, after we discuss this, that I give them is basically they go get a secondary psychological article. Well, the first time I give them a secondary psychological article that I know has problems. And then I ask them to work together and answer the questions on this slide together, and we discuss it in class. And then after that, I asked them to take an article, a secondary article that they picked up for their paper, and I want them to critique that using these. And so they have to go do the research. Who is this person who's written this article? What's their expertise? All of that kind of thing. Are they quoting? I make them go and find, okay, they've given some information from the secondary article. Go back and look at the primary article and see if it's right. And they often find it's not. So they don't always love this assignment at first. I think it's great. But they begin to learn things because they are shocked at how often information is repeated incorrectly. So thanks for adding that and pushing us to do some of these assignments. And then moving forward, one other I want to mention, Cheryl mentioned logical fallacies, and related to Cheryl's description of logical fallacies in our book, we basically added a unit that looks at the logical fallacies she covered, which are listed here, and I don't need to go into any details about them. But then what I do is we describe the fallacy itself, the scary definition, and then we talk about examples of it. So, and in particular, we talk about psychological examples of it. So the slippery slope, and we all know what that is, but a psychological example might be never reduce a fee for any patient for any reason, or else you'll find yourself constantly reducing fees for everyone, and everyone will take advantage of you, and your patients will lose respect for you and for your therapy, and you'll lose money and go get bankrupt. Heavens, giving, exactly, you're giving one person who is in really bad financial shape some therapy, and suddenly you've gone bankrupt. It's horrible. And another one, which I think is a fun one to talk about, is bandwagon appeal. And we all know what the bandwagon effect is, essentially that rather than listening to people who've given evidence or have expertise, we just listen to what our friends think is right, or somebody we respect thinks is right. So an example in psychology might be, all the psychologists I admire believe this therapy helps, so it must help. And maybe the psychologists you run around with believe the same thing you do, and you're not really challenging yourself. And maybe the therapy hasn't been proven to work at all. And so the assignments related to the logical fallacies first is, and they love this assignment I found, go out and find 10 examples of logical fallacies in the social media. So they have to find it in social media, screenshot it, and then explain what fallacy it is and why. And then they bring that back and we discuss it. And it's kind of fun because it helps you narrow in on what the concept is. So like, for example, the bandwagon fallacy. I think it's interesting that the students bring in such different things. So, some students bring in just the right thing. Okay, here's a guy that thinks he's going to get, this last class I had the vaccine stuff was the big stuff they were bringing in and people were arguing about. And so the first person brings in one that says, yeah, this guy thinks he's not going to get that vaccine because all his friends say Bill Gates is injecting a 5G chip in them and they don't want Bill Gates to be able to trace it because Bill Gates. And so anyway, there's that. And, then we talk about as a group, is that a bandwagon? And everybody's like, yeah, that's a bandwagon. Now, another person brought in someone who said, I believe that I'm going to get my vaccine because Dr. Fauci says it's the right thing to do. And then that one was a little more controversial for them because that's just one person, but it's one person who has a lot of expertise. So we talk about the idea that, there's not always a firm boundary here, but, more experts is better. But sometimes somebody has enough expertise, supercharged expertise, that you can go with that. And so, that may not be a bandwagon thing at all. So leads to very interesting discussions. And then for further learning, because it takes a while to kind of process all of the different fallacies, we have a card game, one that we've got from the thinkingshop.org, that has lists, each card has a logical fallacy or a cognitive distortion. And then they get in groups, and each has a pack of cards, and then I read something that represents one of the logical fallacies, and as a group they have to decide which logical fallacy it is. And so they have a lot of discussion and learning among each other about what these logical fallacies mean and which one it is. And then each group presents, we think it's this one because blah, 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 blah. And, eventually we come to the consensus that it's probably this logical fallacy or this cognitive distortion, but sometimes people can do more than one at once because they have a lot of skill in that area. And so anyway, we do that. So, try to make some of these things fun, where people can learn from each other. And in fact, students do work on the topics in groups in our class. So those are two examples of how we've responded to the book.
Okay. Normally, we would ask you all for questions, but because we're recording this ahead of time because of conflicts in our schedule later, we'll maybe just talk a little bit about, we'll have the informal discussion ourselves and talk about key takeaways and maybe any parting advice. I do have a question for Carol and Jeanette, and that is, how did you find a publisher for this book? I mean, it's published by Kendall Hunt. How did you go to multiple publishers and settle on them? Yay, they accepted your book proposal, or how did that work?
They actually called me.
Yay.
I know that that's not the typical way that these things come about, but it is a publisher that our department has worked with in the past to produce some materials for our students. So they have a relationship with our department. So they actually approached us knowing, I'm not sure how they did it. I wondered if they looked at like our book submissions and saw maybe we were, cobbling together some things and wondered, hey, would you be interested in something like that? And since I'm not the sole person that teaches this course, I reached out to Carol and said, hey, Kendall Hunt called and wondered if we wanted to put something together for our class, and I don't feel right doing it on my own, that I'm not the only one that teaches it. Is it something that we could work together on to do?
Mm-hmm. It's kind of interesting. If you have faculty in other departments who want to write books like this, I think just from going to I went to the IWAC conference a couple of years ago as a psychologist and found that they were very interested in those of us who weren't English professors and whether we would be willing to write books about writing in psychology or writing in business. And so I think there's a variety of outlets out there.
Looking for people to...
Mm-hmm. Although I do think it's always best for, I don't think we would have wanted to write it just ourselves.
No.
It's always best to include knowledgeable people, both in the class itself and for book chapters.
So the contributors that were psychologists, maybe people you knew from grad school or former students who are now out and practicing, what was the response from them? Did you have to ask a lot of people in order to get enough, or?
No. Surprisingly, I think we had maybe 2 turn us down.
If that.
And that was mainly just, well, I'm working on this other thing right now, and I don't think I could meet your deadline. Not I don't want to help you, or I don't find value in this, or I don't have anything to contribute. It was more of just, I know one specifically that I reached out to. he was working on a book of his own and didn't have time to do this. We also we gave our contributors very detailed sort of expectations, right? So answer these types of questions. This is the format that we would like it in so that all of our issue chapters were consistent. They had to have, for the issue chapters specifically, they had to have 3 pro points, 3 con points, very outlined in what they wanted. They weren't very long, maybe 10, 15 pages long. It really wasn't. For a psychologist, that's not a lot of space. But we didn't have a hard time we had a hard time eliminating, some of the topics to make it just 10.
And I think the most important thing to us while we were picking those people is to find people who could write about issues where there were truly 2 sides that were fairly equally supported issues. Because some of the books we had worked with previously would have these issues, but it would be more like one side was supported and the other side was a myth. And so that's really hard, given that we want them to truly argue 2 sides.
In real life,
of an
it's not always that black and white.
Right. And so we really wanted to find things where there was research on both sides. I mean, contact sports are great for kids. They learn a lot of teamwork, and it pushes them maybe to do better in their classes. On the other hand, if you're playing contact sports repeatedly while your brain is developing,
Might not be great.
there's some long-term problems.
We're actually about out of time,
Okay.
which is good and sad at the same time. It's just one of those pro-con things. But I think I would say in closing that it's important for those initial planning meetings for them to be done at a Mexican restaurant with queso.
Yes, that definitely
If I leave you with nothing else, I leave you with that bit of advice.
Some of the best thinking comes with chips and cheese.
Exactly.
In fact, we probably should have had some right here.
So, thank you very much. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.